Hello, good evening to everybody in Ankara. Good afternoon to everyone in the UK on Zoom. And good afternoon or evening, where depending on what time zone you're on, delete as appropriate, or good morning. So welcome to the British Institute at Ankara. And we're absolutely delighted this evening to have such an interesting event. So Joe has been visiting Turkey for almost a week now. So you're starting to feel almost like a family member. So we're delighted to have Joe here today talking about, I think, a really important and often overlooked figure in our shared British and Turkish heritage. So I think it's entirely appropriate that in the week of International Women's Day, we are talking about the very great Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. But I won't talk too much about Lady Mary. That's definitely our speaker's job. So let me introduce our speaker. So this evening, we're hearing from Jo Willett, who was a television drama producer for many years and has now turned her hand towards writing historical biographies. And her historical biographies have been looking at or unearthing stories about women who've often been overlooked, and particularly in the 18th century. But Jo is a proud recipient of a BAFTA, a Royal Television Society Award, and an International Emmy. For many of us, I think we'll be familiar with her show, the show that produced Birds of a Feather, which is a real classic on British television, and also the series A Rather English Marriage. Now, The Pioneering Life of Mary Wortley Montagu is her first book, and it's about the woman who brought smallpox inoculation to the West. And was published during the COVID crisis in April 2021. Her second book, Sarah Siddons, The First Celebrity Actress, is due to be published in May. So that's also something to look out for. So Jo now lives in London and West Dorset, but today she's speaking from Ankara. So please welcome to the stage, Jo.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be in Ankara. She shines like a comet. She is always irregular and always wandering. She is the most wise, most imprudent, loveliest, disagreeablest, best-natured, cruelest woman in the world. And those were the words of the young Joseph Spence, who was a tutor to a nobleman in Florence, and he met Mary in 1741 when she was middle-aged, 52. He was a young man, and he thought she was absolutely wonderful, as you can tell. So Mary was born in 1689. That's in the reign of William and Mary. She was born in London, and she was noble. Her parents had had an arranged marriage, and she was their first child. They were in London for the coronation of William and Mary. And we don't know what day she was born, but we do know that she was baptized in May 1689. Her father here, Evelyn Pierpont, rose to become the Duke of Kingston. Her mother, Mary Fielding, who was related distantly to the novelist Henry Fielding. Her mother died when Mary was 3, leaving behind 4 children, of which Mary was the oldest. And her father didn't know what to do with these children, so he sent them off to live with his mother in West Dean in Wiltshire, while he continued the life of a rake, drinking a lot, you can tell by his bills, womanizing, etc. But then Mary didn't get on particularly well with her grandmother, actually, and her grandmother died when she was 12, and then the siblings were split up, and Mary went with her favorite sister and her only brother to Thoresby, and you can see Thoresby here. It burnt down during Mary's lifetime, so the house doesn't exist, but there is a Victorian house on that site. And there, Mary and Frances, the other sister, were just basically left alone. It was a very grand house. Their father was often in London. There were masses of servants. They had governesses, but the aim of the governesses was to teach them sewing and art and dancing, not to educate them. So, but by chance, in Thoresby was one of the most amazing libraries in the whole of Europe. And I don't really think anybody had read it, looked at it particularly, but the two little girls went into the library and they pretended to the governesses that they were studying romances, reading romances, but in fact they were teaching themselves Latin and Greek. And soon they were able to read Ovid and they began to write themselves. So it's an amazing story, really, so that she was self-educated, and being clever was always very, very important to her. And you can see why. If you were noble in those days, you had an arranged marriage. And so as she got to her late teens, she and her friends, you can tell from her letters, were quite excited about entering the marriage market. And here is Edward Wortley Montagu, who Mary was to marry. They met when she was 20 and he was 31. She was friendly with his sister, Anne Wortley Montagu, who died quite early on in the courtship, which made things a little bit difficult for them. By this time, Edward was a barrister and an MP, so obviously he was 11 years older than her, but he fell for her immediately, not only for her looks, but also for her brain. And things seemed good because it was quite unusual to meet somebody who you were interested in and you might love, but also suitable to marry. Mary and her friends, because we had their letters, divided their suitors into three categories: heaven, hell, and limbo. And for Mary, to begin with, Wortley was heaven. So she was having a very good time with him. But Wortley was quite a stubborn figure and quite kind of, he was very much a man of business. He liked things to be straightforward. He and Mary's father fell out over the marriage negotiations over a rather complicated thing called entail, to do with what was going to happen when previous generations inherited money. And so the negotiations dragged on. And Evelyn Pierpont, Mary's father, rather sort of cooled the idea of marrying. And so instead he introduced Mary to another suitor, an Irish peer, who has the wonderful name of Clotworthy Skeffington. But Mary took one look at Clotworthy Skeffington and she knew that for her, he would be hell. It's interesting, you wonder quite what was wrong, but it was very clear to her that that wasn't right. But by now, Wortley had become her limbo. She wasn't particularly interested in him, but on the other hand, he was still keen on her. And he wrote to her suggesting that they should elope. And obviously that was going to lead to quite, if they were to elope, then that would mean that she'd be cut off financially and she would lose social status. But in August 1712, they did elope. He wonderfully wrote to her that before the night before they got married, I beg that once you're in the carriage, we will this once try to avoid talking to each other until we've met the parson, because he was worried they were going to quarrel before they got there. So they had very little money when they were first married. And so they realized they couldn't afford to live in London. But they rented a house outside York, which you see here, which still stands today. And that's the picture I took. They rented a house called Middlethorpe Hall, which is owned by the National Trust in England today. They liked the fact it was just outside York because it meant that if people came to stay, they could just give them tea. They wouldn't have to stay the night or have an expensive dinner. And also the landlord threw in the deal a year's supply of coal and beer. So they settled into life in York together, and their only son, Edward, was born at that time. He was always quite a sickly child, and Mary worried about him hugely, and she was always cross that Wortley didn't seem particularly worried about him. But their fortunes changed when Queen Anne, who had succeeded from William and Mary, Queen Anne died, and George I came to the throne, the Hanoverian king, George I. Queen Anne had been pro the Tories, but George I wanted to support the Whigs. And the Wortley Montagus and indeed the Pierponts were all very, very keen Whigs. So Wortley saw his chance. And he was given a job in the Treasury pretty quickly in London. So he went to London. And to begin with, Mary stayed in York, but pretty quickly she could see that she wanted to get to London. So she wrote him a letter, which was kind of an ultimatum. And he agreed that she should come to London to a rented house. Interestingly, she wrote to him saying she was a bit concerned. She'd heard that the people in the house had died of smallpox. And she said, can you make sure that you've got rid of the sheets, because we don't want to sleep in their sheets, because obviously people didn't know how smallpox was carried. But once Mary got to London, she absolutely blossomed. She immediately became part of a whole group of young writers and thinkers of the time. She was great friends with the Irish portrait painter Charles Jervis, and she used to go to his house, and there he'd be painting some of the famous people of the day, and she would be talking. She became friends with William Congreve, who was the playwright, and John Gay, the writer who wrote The Beggar's Opera, you can see in the middle there. But most importantly, she became great, great friends with the poet Alexander Pope, and you can see Pope on the left there. I don't know if any of you know much about Alexander Pope. He was an outsider like Mary. I mean, she was noble, but she was a woman. She was an outsider. She was self-educated. He was Catholic, so he could never take any public office. He could never be a member of parliament. And he had as a boy Pott's disease, which is tuberculosis of the bone. So he was quite small. He wasn't 5 foot, and he was in constant pain. He always had to wear a corset. So his life was much more like that of a woman than a man. And like Mary, he lived on his wits. So he was very, very clever with words. And I think they immediately sparked off each other. And it was a very, very close friendship. And Mary and John Gay and Pope began writing together. They would write poems and they'd pass them around between themselves, and they would add different lines. And Virgil had written a series of poems called the Pastoral Eclogues, and they wrote 18th century versions, the Town Eclogues, which satirise life in London. They're very interesting to read even today. And Mary actually wrote one about the smallpox. But one of them criticised Princess Caroline of Ansbach, the Princess of Wales, for the fact that she had rather ugly ladies in waiting and she treated them rather badly. And these poems were just passed around. They weren't published at that point. Princess Caroline got hold of them, and she was slightly cross with Lady Mary for having written that. But then worse than that, the letters were then published, the poems were then published. That was, although it meant that Mary was immediately rather a famous kind of it girl, because suddenly she had these best-selling poems, it wasn't really what Wortley wanted. It was not great for her. And then disaster struck. And here on the right, you can see how disaster is going to strike. Because in December 1715, Mary contracted smallpox, the disease smallpox. At the time in Europe, 1 in 10 people lost their life from smallpox. And it was predominantly disease of children. So nearly every family had lost a child to smallpox. Mary's only brother had died in 1713, 2 years earlier, of smallpox, and she'd been devastated at his loss. What happens, first of all, you get a very high temperature. So she was aware that things were bad. She sent young Edward away, and Wortley, her husband, was up north because his family business was up north mining near Newcastle. So he was out of the way. And what would happen with smallpox, you'd begin to get a rash starting at your hands and your feet, which would spread up towards the trunk and then also into the mouth. So you found it very, very difficult to talk. You often couldn't swallow. And then that rash, then they all turned to sores. So these sores are very swollen and red, which again makes it even more difficult to breathe and to talk. And then they emit a yellow pus, and that yellow pus is important in our story. That's why I have to dwell on it, which was very foul swelling. That would go on for about 5 days. During that time, doctors would come. They might make you very, very hot, or they might make you very, very cold. But actually, that made no difference at all. There was lots of talk about humours, and that's why it was caused. But of course, that wasn't the case at all. But if you survived those 5 days, your fever would go down and you probably would live. Mary wasn't expected to live. The newspapers said that she was likely to die, but she did survive. And those then sores would turn to what you call pustules. So it was like having dried peas under your skin, all over your skin. And then the pustules would then become scabs. And of course, the scabs you see here gives you the very, very disfiguring rash on your face or spots on your face. And that was a very, very familiar sight in 18th century Britain, people who'd had the smallpox and were left with that. But that wasn't the only after effect. People often had very bad mental health issues afterwards. And Mary herself lost her eyebrows and her eyelashes. And her friends said afterwards she always had the Wortley stare. And so she had lost her looks. She could no longer be a courtier. You weren't welcome at the court of George I if you looked like that, sadly. And also she'd had these poems published. So Wortley was absolutely devastated when he came south to see her again. And Mary wrote in her town eclogue about smallpox that the doctor who had looked after her, Samuel Garth, had said to her, "You shall again be well, again be fair." And she said, "False was his oath, my beauty is no more." So it was a very, very bad time for the Wortley Montagus, with Wortley not doing very well in the Treasury, the town eclogue was published, and Mary having lost her looks. But by chance, the following summer, Wortley was offered the chance to become the ambassador, the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. Now, when men, it was always men in those days, white men were appointed ambassadors. Normally, you lasted for about 5 years, and you would go out by yourself because it was obviously very dangerous traveling. You don't know what you were going to go to, so you'd be gone for a long time. But Mary, being Mary, was adamant she was not going to miss this opportunity. She had never traveled abroad at all, but she was determined to go. She put on a black wig, which she wore the whole way, and they hired various people to go with them, including a doctor called Dr. Maitland or Mr. Maitland, Charles Maitland, and he was Scottish, and he was interested in the fact that earlier in the century, sort of 1705, there had been a paper given at the Royal Society by an Italian saying that the Turks inoculated against the smallpox, protect themselves against the smallpox. So it was not a serious problem in Turkey in the way that it was in England. So Mary travelled out, and of course they had young Edward as well in the carriage. They travelled across Europe in the carriage. It took them about 10 months to make it across Europe, and they passed, it was quite dangerous. They passed battlefields on the way, and they were extremely lucky to make it. And Mary wrote a series of letters which are published today called the Turkish Embassy Letters, which talk about her journey across, and then actually her time in Constantinople, and then and Adrianople, and then her travels back. And what happened was she kept copies of the letters that she wrote back to people. And then when she came back to England, she was friendly with an older single lady called Mary Estelle, who was a very significant early feminist. And Mary Estelle encouraged her to edit the letters and put them together in a volume called the Embassy Letters. But again, because she knew that she didn't want to have them published, not going to be published until after she died. It was agreed they were just going to be circulated. Mary Estelle wrote a very praising prologue, flattering prologue about the letters. And on the way to Turkey, Mary spent some time in Belgrade and Sofia with a man called Ahmed Beg. So he was Muslim, and he taught her an awful lot about life in the East. And after she'd seen him, she went to a Turkish bath. Now that's a 19th century image of somebody imagining what that must have been like. It's a very famous letter she wrote when she went to visit a Turkish bath. She went by herself, and she couldn't believe the beauty of these women because, of course, they weren't pockmarked. And they said to her, it's very, very hot. I mean, obviously they were speaking in Turkish, so she couldn't understand them. Why don't you take off your clothes? And she eventually had to show them. She opened up her skirt to reveal she had stays underneath, wooden stays to make the skirt flounce out. And she wrote that she thought that they must have felt that she was the person who was imprisoned by her man, not them. So she had very interesting views about Turkish women, and she was always very, very interested in the condition of women in Turkey. And below is the picture of her with young Edward, painted by a French painter called Van Moor, who was living in Constantinople at the time. And Mary became the first woman, she learnt Turkish, and she became the first woman to dine alone with the wives of dignitaries. So she talked a lot to them and learnt about their lives. She also was very brave, characteristically brave. She put on Turkish men's clothes and she went off to see the sights. She was going to make the most of the time, and she writes about how much she loved Turkey immediately. She thought it was a really interesting country. Now, we don't exactly know how Mary herself learned about inoculation. Dr. Maitland might have told her. The Royal Society had this paper. She, as a woman, could never be a member of the Royal Society, but she might have heard about it. And it's fairly likely, I think, that the Turkish wives would have talked to her about it, but we don't exactly know. But she was very, very interested in it. What happens, just to explain to you about inoculation, so inoculation or engraftment. Now, inoculation comes from the Latin in the eye, and engraftment is a kind of horticultural term. But what you did, if you were Turkish, was you would every spring send away a party of people who hadn't been inoculated to be separate from everybody else. And then you would arrange for a Greek or Armenian woman, normally illiterate, so they relatively poor, and you have to say, presumably they did that because they thought, well, it wouldn't matter if those women died. And they would send that woman to somebody who had smallpox, and she would collect a little bit of the foul yellow pus in a bottle, which she would then keep warm and bring back to the party, the smallpox party. And she would then make cuts in all their wrists and in their ankles, and sometimes also in their foreheads to make the shape of a cross, one assumes, even though they were Muslim. She probably was Christian, keeping a bit of an eye on that superstitiously. And a little bit of pus was then introduced into those cuts, and then she would pour the rest of the pus into a walnut, and she would bind that to the cuts, hence the walnuts in the picture. And then you would wait 10 days. Those people would keep away from everybody else. They'd just be with the smallpox party. And in 8 to 10 days, they would have a very, very mild form of smallpox. So you've seen what uninoculated smallpox looked like. But here you would maybe have 50 to 100 spots, hardly anything. And then a few days later, you would be fine. So Mary waited till Wortley was away. And then, which I think is very significant, and then she and Maitland had her son, young Edward, inoculated, and he was fine, running about pretty quickly. And she wrote to Wortley rather cross again that he wasn't particularly interested in that, but Edward was fine. How we know about smallpox is that she wrote a letter, which is in the embassy letters, to her childhood friend Sarah Chiswell. And in it, she talked about the fact that the doctors back in England wouldn't really be very keen about hearing about this because they were going to lose their fees for what they were doing. And she wrote to Sarah, perhaps if I live to return, I may have the courage to war with them. She wasn't sure she'd necessarily make it back, and she knew it was going to be a war if she made it back. By then, the Wortley Montagus had also had their only daughter, Mary. And Mary was a baby, so she could have been inoculated. But Lady Mary decided not to do that because baby Mary had an Armenian nurse. And Lady Mary didn't want the Armenian nurse to get smallpox. And she realized that if she inoculated her daughter, she already understood that she would have needed to isolate the baby. And she didn't want to do that. She wanted to keep the baby with the Armenian nurse. So that's why I call her a scientist, because the word scientist didn't exist in those days, but she was already doing an experiment and she was thinking these things through. She was working it out for herself. Wortley Montagu's time didn't last 5 years. There was a change in government and he was recalled. Turkey was on the wrong side of a war against the Austrians, but we won't dwell on that now. So they rather reluctantly came back. Both of them were quite sad to have to leave because they'd had a great time. And Mary arrived back in December of 1718. In 1719 in England, there was another terrible outbreak of smallpox, but she didn't dare do anything about it. She left young Mary uninoculated. But in January 1721, there was an even worse outbreak, and she decided she needed to do something about this. Dr. Maitland wrote that smallpox seemed to go forth like a destroying angel, and everybody kept to their houses, and they would send servants out to see how things were going on. Now, bear in mind, I wrote my book before COVID, so when I was researching that, and I thought, God, how amazing, they stayed in their houses. Incredible. It must have been terrible for them, never realizing it was going to happen to all of us. She wrote to Maitland, and he came to Twickenham, and April 1721, so just over 300 years ago, they agreed, Maitland was a bit reluctant, but they agreed to inoculate young Mary. Maitland wanted to have physicians standing by for the whole thing, but Lady Mary didn't want to do that. She finally agreed that they would wait until young Mary had got her spots and she was no longer infectious, and then they would allow a few doctors, 3 doctors, to come and see the little girl, and also several ladies and other persons of distinction, as Charles Maitland wrote. One of the doctors, he had lost both his older sons to smallpox, but he had one little boy left, Peter Keith, and he said, could he be inoculated? But he was a doctor, so they thought, well, we can't just do inoculation, we can't just make the cuts and add the stuff. We'll have to bleed him and purge him to make it seem medical. So that's what happened to Peter Keith, and he came through fine, and he was inoculated and protected against smallpox the rest of his life. The next link in the story is that Princess Caroline of Ansbach, who is here, who is the Princess of Wales at the time, she got news of what had happened. Now, we don't know how that happened, but we have to assume that one of the ladies and persons of distinction must have told her about it. William and Mary, who I was mentioning, Queen Mary, she had actually died of a smallpox, and various other members of the royal family had also died of it. So Princess Caroline knew that it would be a really, really useful tool in terms of keeping her family in power. So she began to lobby for it. And she lobbied directly, whereas Lady Mary kept behind the scenes. But they were very much allies. Lady Mary always said to Princess Caroline that Princess Caroline was her firm support and stood by her without quaking, as if Lady Mary took the lead. But publicly, it looked like Princess Caroline was taking the lead. And Princess Caroline suggested that they have something called the Newgate experiment, where they took 6 prisoners in Newgate prison who were all condemned to death. And if they volunteered to be given, to be inoculated against smallpox, and they survived, then they'll be allowed to walk free. 5 of them got smallpox and were able to walk free. 1 didn't get, when he was inoculated, didn't get smallpox because he'd already had smallpox. So he was sadly condemned to death. And then people said, yes, but do we really know, okay, you're inoculated against smallpox, but do we know you're protected against the future? So one of those prisoners went to Dr. Maitland's practice and lay with a patient who had natural smallpox, lay in their bed for the whole time, and they didn't get ill. So that proved that you were protected. And then a year to the day from when young Mary had been inoculated, 2 daughters of Princess Caroline and Prince George were inoculated. And Mr. Maitland, Charles Maitland, wrote his only account, the only existing account of the whole thing, which is Mr. Maitland's account of inoculating the smallpox, and there it is. Princess Caroline was very keen that her eldest son, the heir to the throne, Prince Frederick Louis, be inoculated. He was in Hanover at the time, because of course they were German. So Sir Hans Sloane, the royal physician who's here, and Mr. Maitland went off to Germany to inoculate Frederick Louis. Sir Hans Sloane wasn't quite sure about smallpox, and so he thought, just to be safe, he better just check with George I as to what whether he thought it was a good idea that his grandson was going to be inoculated. And George I asked what the odds were to survive, and he was told that 1 in 1,000 people died of if you were inoculated. And George I went, oh, well, that's good enough odds, let's do that. Which again, I think is very interesting when you think how people reacted to vaccination of the COVID when they were so worried about the risks. You would have thought that Mary, having done this thing, that people would be absolutely thrilled by what she had done. And her reputation would be secure, but not a bit of it. She said that never a day went by after that when she didn't regret having done what she'd done. And she said, what an arduous, what a fearful, and what I may add, what a thankless enterprise it was. Sir Hans Sloane wrote an account of everything, but in it he credited Wortley, who after all was away when both inoculations had taken place. And he didn't mention at all about Twickenham, which is actually the really historic thing, because in Turkey, a previous ambassador had his two sons inoculated, but to inoculate young Mary by themselves in England was the really historic thing. And the whole country, of course, got very pro and against inoculation, as these things do. It became very politicized. The Whig Party were keen on it. The Tories were against it. The Church of England were very against it because they said you're taking somebody who's well and you're making them ill, and that's against God's will. There was a lot of anti-Turkish propaganda in the British press, and also a lot of anti-German because the royal family were German. And William Wagstaff wrote something talking about how a few ignorant women upon slender experience have introduced this to Britain. And of course, it was really a folk practice, but in order to make it accepted, it had to be medicalized. So people who went through inoculation had to go on a special diet, and they had to be bled, and they had to be purged. And that was difficult for Mary because she knew that you didn't really need to do that. And eventually she could contain it no more. And she wrote an anonymous letter from a Turkey merchant pointing out that you didn't really need to do that. And she and her young daughter used to go off to different aristocratic households in the southeast of England at their invitation, and they would inoculate the whole household from the lord right down to the lowest servant. And her daughter wrote about how when they were going off to these places and they were in their carriage, people would jeer at the carriage as it went by. And the common people were taught to hoot at her as being an unnatural mother. And there were lots of looks of dislike and significant shrugs of nurses and servants when they went into the household. So it wasn't easy. As so often with things, it wasn't actually a bundle of laughs. I think it's important to talk about the difference between inoculation and vaccination, which I have to say I didn't understand until I started researching my book. So I'm explaining to you about inoculation. And inoculation during Mary's lifetime became increasingly accepted, so that by 1745, actually Mary was living abroad by that time, but the first smallpox hospital opened. And a man called Daniel Sutton commercialized the whole thing. So you would go to Daniel Sutton's organization and you'd be kept for a month and be given the right food, and you'd be bled and you'd be purged. He was called the Great Inoculator. But it wasn't, although it was doing quite well, a lot of people were still dying from it, probably because they didn't understand about self-isolation, and for other reasons as well. The bleeding and purging probably caused the deaths of some people. It was generally known that milkmaids, in other words, young women who made their living by milking cows, so their hands were touching the udder of cows, they never got smallpox, and they always had beautiful skins. So in England, we have various nursery rhymes about milkmaids having beautiful skin. So my fate is my fortune, sir, she said. Sir, she said, it's because they had beautiful skin unaffected by smallpox. And that was because they were getting cowpox from the cows. And that's a related disease to smallpox, but they weren't really aware they were getting ill. And there was actually a farmer in the West Country in the 1760s who tried it out, rather than introducing smallpox to the cuts, he introduced cowpox to his wife and daughters. But he wasn't a scientist. But on the left, you see Edward Jenner, who was a scientist. He was a doctor, and he was a member of the Royal Society. And he was very sickly as a teenager, so he was inoculated, and he had a really terrible experience of all these diets and bleeding and purging, and he thought there had to be a better way. So he looked into cowpox, and in 1798, he gave a paper to the Royal Society, so 80 whole years after Mary had brought inoculation to the West. And the Royal Society accepted that this might be a better way. this might be an easier way of protecting people against the smallpox. It seemed to be safer. So now we tend to think of vaccination as a shot in the arm, but it wasn't like that. As you see on the right, it was hand to hand, it was given hand to hand, like inoculation. So cowpox was introduced to these cuts rather than smallpox. And here you see people trying to get cowpox matter from a cow. And for 40 years, the two different ways of curing smallpox coexisted. So you might be inoculated and you might be vaccinated. And in fact, inoculation protected you from smallpox for the rest of your life, whereas vaccination only protected you for about 10 years. But gradually, in the Victorian times, it was decided to fade out inoculation, and vaccination took over. But of course, for Mary, we all think about smallpox, but it was really only quite a small part of her life. And she had a very varied and very interesting life, which if you read my book, you'll find out all about. But so she and Wortley Montagu, they were living back in London, and they bought another house in Twickenham, which is just outside London, where Alexander Pope lived. And so they were very into gardening, and Mary's garden gave on to Pope, since she spent a lot of time with him. When they'd been traveling in Europe, Pope had been very sad to see her go, and he wrote a series of letters to her, which became increasingly unguarded. I mean, if you read them today, they feel like he is a sexual predator. He talked about missing her Oriental self, and about how they were like a couple who, as soon as they were alone together, would rush to take their clothes off. And she was receiving these letters. Obviously, she was married. It was quite difficult for her. He even wrote some poems that were really for her. And she wrote back to Congreve saying, why has he sent me these lampoons? But as she got closer to come back to England, she realized this was going to be a major problem. And Pope had sent her a poem about a young couple who'd been struck by lightning in Stanton Harcourt. And he wrote a poem saying how incredibly romantic it was that they'd died together. And so Lady Mary thought she would deal with this by she wrote a response to Pope, saying, now they are happy in their doom, for Pope has wrote upon their tomb. And he received this and he got the message. So for a few years, they continued to be friends, but slightly more distant friends within the same social circle. But then in the 1730s, something went wrong between them. We don't exactly know what happened, but something happened. Her family always said that he did declare his love for her and that she laughed at him, but we don't know whether that really happened. Other people said some story about how he borrowed some she borrowed some sheets from him and returned them dirty. So there was always a lot of stuff with her about how she had very bad female hygiene. So the relationship with Pope was a very difficult one. And he, because he was a published writer, he was very powerful. He could write poems against her, and he absolutely laid into her. And he actually had supported her. He understood what a very important thing she was doing with smallpox. But once he was an enemy, he used it in his poems. So he described her as being poxed. And everybody who knew meant that was obviously referring to her because of the fact the smallpox, but also it had the implication that she had a venereal disease, that she was poxed because she had syphilis. So there she was in Twickenham in London, in middle age. And you see in the middle there the picture, the portrait that lots of us saw last night, because that portrait is in the embassy. And that was painted when she was 47 in 1736. And that year she met the young Italian on the left, who was 24 at the time, so nearly half her age, Francesco Algarotti. Now, I think she was pretty vulnerable at that point. The Pope had meant that she had lost a lot of her friends. She was quite socially isolated. The marriage with Wortley had never been great. They were very different from each other. He was very distant. She had invested unwisely in some South Sea shares, and she'd lost money. It was very awkward, and he was very angry with her because of that. Things were not good between them. Their only son, Edward, who they'd taken to Turkey, had grown up, but he was a constant source of worry to them. He ran away from school. He went to be a cabin boy. They lost him for about 18 months, and then they tried to sort of send him away with a tutor to make things better. He always drank a lot. He got into debt. He actually ended up in prison in France. He was always a huge worry to them. Their daughter Mary was very conventional. She was got on well with her mother, but then she fell in love with John Stuart, the Earl of Bute, and her parents didn't really think that Bute was quite up to it. So they allowed the marriage. Obviously, after all, they'd eloped, so they couldn't make a big thing about it, but they weren't happy. And so again, that was a problem for Mary. So she was vulnerable, but Algarotti absolutely made a beeline for her, and I'm pretty sure seduced her, and she fell completely in love with him. She knew at the time that she was making herself very vulnerable by this. Algarotti wasn't noble. He had to live on his wits, and he pretty much took to bed anybody who was helpful to him. And what she didn't realize that he was bisexual and actually bedding a lot of men. He had come from France on the way from Italy, and with letters from Voltaire, and he, within a week of his arriving, he was invited to be a member of the Royal Society and celebrated. And what she didn't know was that her great friend John Harvey, who she'd co-written some poems with against Pope, was also bedding Algarotti at the same time. But after a couple of years of this, Mary decided, or at least she believed, that she and Algarotti had decided that in 1739, she would set out to Venice and they would start a life together living in Venice. So she set out by herself. She didn't tell Wortley what she was doing. And she said to everybody that it was suffering from her health. I mean, I think she was probably depressed, but she set out. Meanwhile, Algarotti thought he could probably pursue a career in diplomacy. So he went off to St. Petersburg with another of his conquests to see if he could be an ambassador. And then he traveled south and he went to the Prussian court and met the future Frederick the Great, young Prince Frederick, who he also bedded. And Prince Frederick fell for him and described him as a swan of Padua, that became his nickname. But Frederick then sent Algarotti to Turin on an ambassadorial mission. And so Mary sought out Algarotti, and for 2 months, they were locked in a palazzo together. We don't know what went on between them, but at the end of it, both of them said that the relationship was at an end. So what was Lady Mary going to do then? She was middle-aged. She didn't really want to go back. So bravely, she decided to stay on in war-torn Europe. And she lived there for 23 years, traveling around. She had to keep moving because of problems with, she settled somewhere and then it got involved in a war. And 10 years at that time, she was also under what seems to me coercive control of another Italian nobleman who stole all her money. So again, an amazing story, really. But she eventually settled in Venice and Padua. By then, Algarotti was retired, and they were became quite friendly, actually. It seemed to work okay. But in 1761, Wortley died. Now, Mary and Wortley had never seen each other after she left, but they had written to each other. And actually, they did manage to have a very kind of respectful relationship by letter, long term. He died, and he died one of the most wealthy men in England. But his will was very, very controversial because it left everything to their daughter and nothing to their son. And immediately, the son contested the will. And Mary got word of this because he used his mother to say, well, actually, she's pro me. So Mary thought, I can't let this lie. I've got to go back to fight this. She already knew she had breast cancer, so she knew she was dying. But she set off across Europe to get back to England and see if she could put this right. And on the way, she stopped in Rotterdam, and knowing that she was dying, and she met a priest called the Reverend Benjamin Sowden. She'd never met him before. She pressed into his hands the embassy letters, and she said, please make sure that these get published after I die. And then she returned to England, and she met up again with her daughter. She'd only known one of her grandchildren. She met 11 other grandchildren. She arrived in January 1762. The Buttes actually weren't that keen to see her. I mean, obviously they were thrilled to see her, but she was slightly embarrassing, and she had very different manners from them. And they were very, very upright. And during the time that she lived there, Butte became prime minister. So he really didn't particularly want to have this slightly embarrassing mother-in-law around the place. So she died in the August of 1762, and they buried her really quite quickly. Within sort of 48 hours, she had a quiet burial in London. And of course, then the Reverend Benjamin Salvin came to see them, clutching the embassy letters. And they said, thank you very much, took the embassy letters from him and destroyed them. But what Salvin didn't know, or nobody knew, was that, well, Salvin must have known that some travelers had borrowed them while he was in Rotterdam, and they had kept them overnight and copied them. So the letters were then published, unauthorized version were published, and they became a huge publishing sensation, and everybody loved everything Turkish. It started a whole vogue in things Turkish. Mary also, throughout her adult life, had kept a journal, and her daughter, young Mary, Lady Bute, read the journal. She was the only person ever to read that journal, and she destroyed it. And I always think that if that journal had survived, Mary would be known, as we know someone like Samuel Pepys, that diary would really, really have meant she was famous. Because I'm going to finish by saying that I do think really we all need to know much more about her. She is a fascinating figure, not just because of smallpox, because of her writings, because of her thinking, because of her incredible life. This is a little town in one of the Italian lakes where Lady Mary had a holiday house. She happened to say this place, Lovere, was one of the prettiest places in the world and reminds her of Tunbridge Wells in Kent. And so they have gone large on how wonderful Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. Everywhere you go, you've got places named after her. But really, you know very little about her in England. And of course, I feel very strongly that you know very little about her in Turkey. And I'm going to charge you all today with seeing if you can find some way of memorializing Lady Mary so that her legacy is remembered for the future.
Okay, I'll speak anyway. Thank you very much, Joe, for that absolutely extraordinary lecture. I was absolutely rapt, to be honest. I was, yeah, really, really fascinating. And you know, I would just say as well, I mean, I'm assistant director at the British Institute Ankara, but before this, I was teaching at Bilkent University, and I taught a course on travel writing, and we actually read the letters of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. And it was interesting then, a lot of students hadn't heard of her. And I think if you study English literature in the UK, it's increasingly, you know, Wortley Montagu is someone that you will read. And it really becomes a part of anything on 18th century literature, but also travel writing. So I think there's a lot that can be done, I think, in terms of bringing her legacy here. And I think she should really be remembered as a key figure in kind of British Turkish cultural relations, actually. So I feel very strongly that we should take that on. So who knows, maybe we should try and is there even a statue of let's see, it reminds me, you know, in Edinburgh, in Ampera, yes. It reminds me, actually, in Edinburgh, there's a horrifying statistic, which is good to know good to talk about, actually, in International Women's Day. There's more statues of animals in Edinburgh than there are of women, which is quite terrifying. So yeah, maybe we should start the campaign for a statue for Montagu tonight. But anyway, without further ado, then we have a second guest this evening. So after that, we've got a discussant who's come from the Social Sciences University of Ankara. So we've got Professor Mine Özgürt Kılıç, who's a professor of English literature with a special focus on women and writing. So you can see why we've invited her this evening. Literary modernism, empathy and writing, theories of the fantastic, matricentric feminism, and many different women writers such as Virginia Woolf, Angela Carter, Ursula Le Guin, Edna O'Brien, Pat Barker, Maggie Gee, and Jeanette Winterson. And the Virginia Woolf link is important here. So she's the co-creator and organizer of the Woolf-related event series, A Press of One's Own, celebrating 100 years of the Hogarth Press, which is the press that Virginia Woolf set up, Harvard University. Also, the Virginia Woolf Studies in Turkey project, which is funded by the British Council, that we're particularly interested in. We should do another event on Virginia Woolf in Turkey. 100 years of literary modernism, 1922 to 2022, the Irish embassy in Turkiye, and understanding literary modernism that included translation and printing workshops, Woolf Joyce Eliot inspired exhibition of Turkish contemporary art, and author meetings. And she designed and taught the first all Virginia Woolf BA and MA course in Turkiye. And she has a forthcoming edited collection of essays with Virginia University Press, Edinburgh University Press, which is called Companion to Transnational Woolf. And I think we can also, there is actually a link with Montagu and Woolf. So I don't know, you might bring that up as well. So anyway, so Minette, would you like to come to the stage? Is it okay for the Zoom? So, yeah. Yeah, would you like to join in?
I should say, by the way, that you can buy a copy of my book if you'd like. Yes. There's a sale afterwards for 600 Turkish lira if you'd like to buy it.
Thank you very much for listening.
Pleasure.
I don't know what else can I say about this.
Oh, we'd like to use my cards. Okay, so. Yeah, we'll use them. Here we go. Yes. Okay.
No.
It should work. I didn't. I just picked it up. Yeah. Oh.
Thank you so much.
There we go.
Well, good evening, everyone. How fascinating it was to learn about this great figure and listening to your talk, of course, reading your book. I have a feeling that we're face to face with a history so dear, so intimate, so skin deep. This is one of the very few occasions in the history of women's writing in which a woman writes about her body as early as 1717.
Yes, that's right.
Of
Yes.
Adrianople and
That's right.
Istanbul. And I think that's a field unexplored yet. And thanks to your book, I believe many things, many can be written. Well, this is a text which we can catalog as history, but we're talking about travel writing, as Peter also suggested. Travel writing in the form of a compilation of letters written so industriously. Then we are talking about an area or intersecting area in which we talk about, in which we can explore the body of this work as a memoir, travel writing, personal essay, historical document. Considering her role as a wife to an ambassador, it lends itself to further research by scholars in international relations, publication history, cultural studies, of course, film studies maybe, because in your idiom or in the hands of a film producer,
well, TV, yes,
TV producer with her BAFTA awards and all that, I could see that you translated Lady Mary Wortley Montagu in visual terms. Sentences are short, journalistic, and I believe this gives us Lady Mary Wortley Montagu in a very authentic way.
Well, that's very nice of you to say, because there is a very, very good academic biography, which is written in the 1990s by Isabel Grundy, which is a wonderful book. And she had done a lot of the primary research. But my aim was to try to make her Lady Mary's story more accessible to lots.
It is.
Yes,
it is more accessible. And what we need is maybe lay readers or, people with interest in so many of these fields, gender studies, travel writing. And of course, your book and your research opens a path, as Lady Mary Montagu does, opens a path in the studies of what we call afterlife of writers. So how can we study women writers? How can we study an 18th century figure or a woman writer who was born in the 17th century, died in the 18th century? So 10 Ways of Looking at a Bird by Wallace Stevens. So in how many ways can we approach this biography, this compilation of letters, this travel writing? I believe a research hub, a group of people, researchers from as many different fields as possible can come together, taking your book, The Pioneering Life of Mary Wortley Montagu, as a scientist, as a feminist, as a guidebook, because the episodic nature of the book with 20 chapters,
That's right.
make it more like an odyssey. 20 years, 10 years there, and 10 years more. Setting out on a journey to make the most of these texts, and then arriving in a, work, product, which will give us Lady Mary as fully as possible as a poet, as a letter writer, as a wife, as a mother, as a scientist.
Yes.
Finally.
Yeah. Yes, but we haven't had time really to talk about writing, because you don't, I mean, apart from the Turkish embassy letters, she wrote a lot of poems. She wrote some other prose pieces, which are very interesting. She wrote a play. Yes, she was always writing. Yes, and I would also say the Turkish embassy letters are wonderful, but also her selected letters, which are edited by Isabel Grandi, which tell the story of her whole life. So you have all the letters she wrote to Wortley when they were courting. And you can sort of read them thinking, oh, I can see this is going to go wrong. And then the poems she wrote to Algarotti, which are so passionate and so different.
So much in love.
Yes, I know. That's right. Yes, which are fascinating. So she's a great person.
And because you set the ground with a full-fledged study on Lady Mary Montagu, now literary scholars can study the poetics of her letter writing. So we can delve into how her way of writing letters, her way of writing about her travels, differ from the male tradition, differ from letter writing tradition of different centuries. Now that we have this bulk of research in front of us, we can move forward and study Lady Mary Montagu's letters from narratology, from a narratological perspective. Well, it of course poses so many questions about what it means to write about, or how it feels to write about travel writing. Here, maybe we can start asking some questions. Do you think it was, you followed in her footsteps, and the wonderful appendix saying following in the footsteps of Lady Mary Montagu, in which you will find yourself in a Burger King.
That's right. Because she went to Venice, and she immediately loved Venice as soon as she arrived. So I went to Venice to see if I could find where she stayed. And in fact, I think that the palazzo she stayed in is now a Burger King opposite the station, which is a bit depressing. But I tried to put a list of all the places you can see, you can visit, which still stand.
Yeah, we can have an itinerary ushered by, guided by the wonderful people here. A walk, Lady Mary Montagu walk, along with the statue, arriving, so making the Odyssey. I know.
Yes, that's right. That's right, definitely.
The final destination being the statue of Lady Mary Montagu in Pera, maybe. But what I'm curious about is did you feel yourself as a travel writer or scholar, or do you think that this was
I'm not really a
this was a
scholar. I wish
travel?
I were. Yes, I know. I'm just
How did you
trying
feel?
to. Was just trying to tell her story in a very empathetic, clear way. And remember, it's my first biography, so I realized how little fact you actually need to make a story clear for a reader. And sometimes now I read back and I think, goodness, there was too much fact there. Because you want to tell the story as clearly as you can. Yes. But I mean, obviously, she was all these different things. That's what's so extraordinary about it. Yes.
And this has to do with all the complications or complexities of these fields as history, as Edward Helen Carr defining history, comparing writing history to fishing. You fish for facts, whatever you find determines the next course. And writing biographies,
it's a bit like
similar.
that. I mean, there are some gaps, like, as I was saying, I wish we could prove that Princess Caroline learned about inoculation from Lady Mary. We actually can't prove that. I mean, there are hardly any letters written in the 20 years she was living in London and Twickenham and married to Wortley. So again, that's a big gap. I mean, we've got some of her creative writing, but we haven't got other things from that time. And actually, someone said to me, I mean, when I was writing the book, someone said, why don't you just write it as fiction? And I did wonder about that, but I'd sold it to the publishers as a factual book, so I had to. And then someone else said to me subsequently, you really should write a novel about the son's life, because his life was just extraordinary. And I think it would make actually a very good novel written by the right person. I don't think I'm necessarily the person to write it, but I mentioned in case anyone else wants to take that up. And actually, someone called Sean Lusk is about to publish in the UK a novel about Lady Wortley. So I've been in touch. Lady Mary Wortley. So I've been in touch with him about that. Yes, so I'm interested to see what that is like. Yes. And there's a one-woman show that's doing the rounds. So, there are other people have become interested in her. Yes. And as I was saying last night, I think the way we know about Virginia Woolf, or we know about Emily Bronte, we know about Mary Shelley, or in terms of science, we know about Marie Curie. These are names we know. We don't actually know everything about them as a layperson, but we know them. And I would like MWM to be like that, to be somebody everyone goes, oh, yes, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, know her.
Okay, we know that many women writers followed in her footsteps.
We should say, shouldn't we, that Virginia Woolf, it looks like, was inspired to write Orlando partly because of MWM dressing up as a man and going to look at the sights in
cross-dressing.
Yes,
definitely. And this issue of fact and fiction merging in her letters. Did you have a feeling that you made a very close reading of all these texts? Do you think there's more fact than fiction in her letters, or there's fiction in her letters?
I'm sure it's a bit fictionalized. I mean, there's lots of fact. I mean, she had kept copies of letters, but certainly she edited them quite carefully. And of course, we don't know what people were writing back to her. So I suspect she probably edited the letters she has included that she wrote to Pope are very, very factual. There's a description of the battlefield of Petrobradin, but she may well have written more intimate stuff to Pope. We don't know.
We don't know.
Yes.
And the collection gives us the feeling that the letters written to her female friends are different in tone. They're more about her personal life.
They are.
Whereas to Pope, especially to the letters to her husband, they're very matter of fact, very direct.
Yes. Well, those aren't in the Turkish embassy letters because he was obviously with her. But the selected letters too, yes. Yes, the selected letters aren't fictionalized because they actually are the letters she wrote. Yes. But the Turkish embassy letters, she did play around with them a bit. But they're fascinating as that.
Another very interesting point about the publication from Rotterdam.
Yes.
So it's the publication history of the compilation. And the prefaces written so far are really interesting. I have had the chance to review some of them for this evening. Anita Desai introduction. She's wonderful. That she's situated in that limbo. Is she an English writer, an Indian living in America?
A different kind of limbo.
Emerita professor at MIT.
Yes.
And she could sense this because of her position. She could, I wonder if you'd agree with that. She discerns a sort of stereoscopic vision in Lady Mary Montagu. She could see herself from the eyes of the Ottoman women. She was not just a gazer.
She did empathize with
Yeah,
them.
she could see herself from their lens, from their perspective. And I think it would, of course, be Anita Desai who would see that, you know, post-colonial.
She praised Pera for being so diverse. She loved that immediately. And again, reading that as someone in the 21st century, I thought, well, that's fantastic. She really embraced that whole idea. Yes.
And another preface by a Scottish cyclist.
Oh, right.
Who cycled
yes.
all, Devon, I'll remember her name.
Right, she's Irish. Yes,
yeah,
that's
the
right.
Irish cyclist. She
Yes.
said she was born too early.
Yes.
So reading that, I remembered your title. Yes, of course. That's why she's a pioneering figure. That's why she led a pioneering life.
Well, I'm glad she did live as early as she did, I have to say, because she did lead the way.
And she makes the comment somewhere in her journals, maybe. She was born rather too early. She had this recognition of her sort of unsettled
Being
position.
ahead of her time. Yes.
Or
I
she
think
was
she
ahead
probably
of
was
her
ahead of her time
time.
in a lot of her thinking. Yes. I was originally going to call it the scandalous life of, and then I said to my publisher, I don't think that's right. I think she's a pioneer. She's not really scandalous.
Or in the idiom of Lady Mary Estelle, as you started your book, she was like a comet.
Yes, that's right. Yes, she was a
so-
comet. She was a comet. Yeah.
Do you think we can receive questions?
Yes, it would be great if
So
we've
the
got
floor
time.
is open.
Yes. Yeah. Anybody. It's always hard to do the first question. Oh.
Sure. Thank you. Can you say something about how you encountered her and her story and what fascinated you about it? What made you want to write about her?
Well, I was looking for a subject matter to write a biography about, and I had studied English and I'd worked a lot with writers all my working life. So I thought probably I'd be writing about a writer. And I went into a cathedral in the middle of England, in a town called Lichfield, or a city is called Lichfield because it's got a cathedral, somewhere that Lady Mary never went. But there is a memorial there by her great niece, and it talks about how she fought against smallpox. And I said to my husband, I don't know this woman. And he said, oh, you must know Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She was that woman who I read about as a footnote when I was researching Pope, studying Pope. I mean, admittedly, he's in his 60s, so he didn't, yes, she fell out very badly with him. She was a terrible woman. And so I thought, oh, that's really interesting. I must get reading. So then I started reading the selected letters and I got completely hooked. And I mean, I was making television programs the whole time, but I kept reading more and more of her stuff and thinking, this is really, really interesting. So that's really what engaged me. Her character just came right through. And then I was reading something online and someone said, what we really need is a populist biography of Lady Mary. And I thought, maybe I could do that. So that's what got me going. Yes.
But of course, there are some scholars in Oriental. Thank you. English literature who study Lady Mary Montagu as a figure who influenced the Orientalists.
Yes.
So those who study Orientalism in Turkey know her and are very proud of her.
I think now people do study. She is known in academic circles.
Yeah,
but if you
because
stop people in the street, they won't know.
No.
That's the thing, which you feel they want
no,
to.
of course.
Yes, know of her. I mean, maybe a little bit more now. Yes.
They're proud of Lady Mary because she says many positive things about Turkish people, and in that she functions as a critic of all those male writers who visited Constantinople and wrote about the things they didn't know, wrote about the things they did think that they knew. So she corrects them, and of course those who want to write about Turkish history, Ottoman history, love our Lady Mary. She was right.
Yes, because I mean, her
Turkish
letter
people
about
are
her
good.
mom. I mean, one traveller hadn't been allowed to go in, and another hadn't really seen her mom. So that's a classic example. As a woman, she was able to get access. Yeah.
Based on what Mine Hocam just mentioned about Ottoman Empire, so I'm curious about as a female expatriate or just as a woman, what Mary Wortley Montagu, what were the observations or reflections related to the Ottoman artwork or women's status in Turkey based on her observations in Turkey? Did she write anything about in the travel memories,
She did.
particularly about women's status
She
in
did,
Ottoman
yes. She was-
culture and the artworks, as you mentioned, because they were very popular at that time, and it was the restoration time in Britain and, you know, in Ottoman time, 18th century. Did you write anything about those artworks?
Nothing specifically I can think about artworks, no, but certainly she was very, very interested in the condition of women, yes. And the fact that she learnt Turkish and she made sort of friends with these wives of dignitaries, and she learnt about their lives there. Ahmed Beg had talked to her a lot about how women were kept separately in harems, and she was very interested in that. She actually did get into the harem, but she wanted to do that, and she wrote a little note saying women not locked up. She didn't think they were locked up in harem. She felt that was okay, and she also talked about how the veil actually gave you freedom because you were able then to go wherever you wanted. She understood that, which again is very interesting for today, I think. Yes.
The 1st of April, 1717, to Lady Mar.
Oh, this is to her
Which
favorite sister, Frances, I was talking about. Yes. This is about clothing, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah. As to their morality or good conduct, I can say like Harlequin that tis just as tis with you, and the Turkish ladies don't commit one sin the less for not being Christians. Now that I'm a little acquainted with their ways, I cannot forbear admiring either the exemplary discretion or extreme stupidity of all the writers that have given accounts of them. 'Tis very easy to see they have more liberty than we have. No woman of what rank soever being permitted to go in the streets without 2 muslins, one that covers her face, all but her eyes, and another that hides the whole rest of her head and hangs halfway down her back, and their shapes are also wholly concealed by a thing they call a ferace, which no woman of any sort appears without. This has straight sleeves that reach to their fingers' ends, and it laps all around them, not unlike a riding hood. In winter, this cloth, and in summer, plain stuff or silk. You may guess then how effectually this disguises them, that there is no distinguishing the great lady from her slave. So that's a leveler as well. And it is impossible for the most jealous husband to know his wife when he meets her, and no man dare either touch or follow a woman in the street.
Yes.
It's protective as well as
Yes, she was
liberating.
saying that. That's right. Yes, yes. No, she was very, very interested in the condition of women there. Yes, and she was also very aware that you had to be a married woman to have status in Turkey, and she contrasted that quite a lot with having been through Catholic countries on the way there. The kind of the cult of the Virgin in Catholic countries, which was very, very different. So she felt that married women did have actually quite good status compared to the married women in Europe. Yes, and I mean, this may be controversial, but she also wrote about how she saw a body, a female body, lying in the street with 2 daggers in it, and she was just very shocked that body was just left there. So she was thinking about women. She really was. And again, it's all very relevant for us today. So very, very interesting.
Say, it's probably time for one more question, but if you do have more questions,
Yeah, I do.
Good. Yes, that's a question. Good.
Definitely got a time during the reception.
Yes.
Well, we do.
All right. Good.
I think there's something to say. Yeah, I was going to say, could we give, sorry, I was going to should we, is it okay for everyone to be a good priority for Zoom? Because there will be a reception, so you can also talk to Joe after as well.
Okay, I'm going over them very quickly. Beaton McRoy says her portrait doesn't show any of her smallpox scars. Why? The portrait in the red dress, the one we have at the embassy.
Yes. Yeah, I think she probably, along with many other women, didn't want to be painted with her smallpox scars. There is one portrait that Pope had in his, even though they fell out, he kept in his best room for the rest of his life. And you could, there's a slight smallpox scarring there, but hardly anything. Yes.
Petiel thanks you so much for the fascinating talk and wonders if you're passing through Istanbul. If so, she would love to meet you for a coffee and talk about researching women in Turkey. Because also her specialist area has been Gertrude Bell and his time and her time in Turkey. Orkun Kocabıyık also thanks you very much for this great talk. And he wonders if Montagu was influenced from traveling in company of her husband, because traveling solo would have different experience.
Yes, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Yes, yeah. I think you see that probably more when they were going to various different courts before they got here. I think here, I mean, he was away a lot. He was very caught up with the Sultan, and he went off with the Sultan went on a journey, and he went with him. So you don't really have such a strong sense of Wortley. I know that the previous British ambassador who was lobbying against Wortley, he wrote that he felt that Wortley was too influenced by MWM. So that way around. But whether he was influencing her, I don't know.
One last question from Suna Güven.
Yeah.
Considering that some of the letters were so personal, what is your feeling about what might have been the tone in her journal that was destroyed by the daughter?
Oh, well, I'm sure it would have been incredibly personal, wouldn't it? Yes, and we'd have learned lots of things about how she felt about so many bits of her life. That's what would have been so interesting. And filling in so many dots. Yes. Yeah.
We comment about Lady Mary Montagu in Turkey.
Yes.
Our professor Esin Akalın, she's now in Toronto. She worked at Kültür University. In 1994, she staged an adaptation of these letters, Lady Mary Montagu's embassy letters, with her students. There's that. And there are several translations, though late. The first translation came in 1933. And then there are various titles like Şark Mektupları, Türkiye Mektupları, Türkiye'den Mektuplar, Doğu Mektupları, Şark Mektupları. And I hope with the introduction of your book, there'll be more translations. And I hope the book will be translated into Turkish.
I'd love that too, definitely.
Thank you.
Hey, yes, I totally agree. This book should be translated into Turkish. We were talking about that just last night, actually. So hopefully that can be the case. And if there's any publishers listening, we can pass you on Joe's details. So for questions here, there are many, I know. We will have a chance now to have a glass of wine or a glass of juice or water. And you'll be able to talk in a more informal setting with Joe and with Mine. But I'd like you all, first of all, to just give a round of applause and a big thank you to Joe and to Mine. And please do follow the British Institute at Ankara on our website. We have events related to all of our disciplines: archaeology, cultural heritage management, Ottoman and contemporary Turkiye, which includes cultural history, literature, film, anything. So yeah, please do follow. But anyway, take care and good evening. Oh, and also please do buy the book. Please do buy Joe's book. Joe will have some on sale here. But also, if you're in the UK or in the US, you can easily buy it. So yes, and there it is, just there. So thanks very much. Bye bye.